Now, oops, we are broadcasting now. We have a couple of attendees.
Okay. Yeah, I can share it now.
Okay. Well, for those attendees who are joining us, we're just getting some early setup going, and we'll be starting in a couple of minutes.
Okay, I'll just go off screen to video, okay?
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen, and I am filling in for your normal host, Sarah Stalker, today, and I'm here to assist the moderator for today's Ontario Native Literacy Coalition webinar, Yuma Hester. Yuma, I'll turn it over to you now, but I'll be here behind the scenes if you need anything at all.
Thank you very much. Just getting my notes together here. My name is Yuma Hester. I'll just start my video here. Thank you very much, Karen, for the introductions and the virtual hosting duties. So I'll be the facilitator. I'm a half Cree, half Anishinaabe, and my mother's side of the family comes from Nashingman, which I'm currently in. It's my home office for the week. My father's community is Moose Factory by way of Waskaganish. I wanted to welcome all of our esteemed participants, supporters. So whether you've been here before or this is your first time, wanted to welcome you. So we will begin shortly here, but I wanted to take a few moments just to do a quick review for those new to the series. The presentation is going to go for about 40 minutes or so, and there'll be a slide deck, which you currently see on your screens right now. And then if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts or any comments, if you could either take notes yourself, or if you want to write them in the chat feed, I'll facilitate all of that after the presentation. So we'll have a question period following the presentation. And yeah, so I wanted to give a huge welcome to our presenter, Dr. Beverley Jacobs, who is a member of the Bear Clan, Mohawk Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. She's Associate Dean at the Faculty of Law, the University of Windsor, and she practices law part-time in her home community of Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Dr. Jacobs is a consultant, a researcher, a writer, and a public speaker. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Yuma. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, so I just want to introduce myself in my language first. Well, actually, the Cayuga language is what my father spoke. So Scano, Sokwego, Giaso, Gawenkuse, Kanyangihaga, Nyakawai, Shoutda, Haudenosaunee. So greetings of peace to all of you. I told you my Bear Clan Mohawk Nation name, which is Gawenkuse, and it means she's visiting. And thank you for the opportunity to come and present to you today. So I've been asked to talk about what it means when we talk about traditional laws, or when we talk about Indigenous legal orders. So I've had the privilege of being raised in my community. I still live in my community. And I really think of it as a privilege, in the how I was raised in our longhouse ceremonies, and I actually didn't realize how much I was taught until I went to law school, and even that was a struggle. And even coming and talking to my parents at the time, and I remember at that time my father was really worried about my decision, although he supported my decision to go to law school, because he thought that that I would get lost in the system. But we soon realized that what the strength of what our teachings are as Haudenosaunee people is what has actually maintained my strength and who I am and where I come from while I was attending university and attending especially to law school, because I was starting to learn about colonial law and how it's been used as a tool to try to erase us as a people. So I pretty well had to educate since then, because a lot of non-Indigenous peoples aren't aware of our history. They're not aware of our knowledge. They're not aware of who we are as a people, and even our own laws. And then as I start even growing and myself and my own healing, and being able to travel into other communities, I started to realize that not everybody was taught about our own laws, and realize that even our own people didn't get taught about our own laws and our own culture and our own ways. So I soon realized that it's important to share this information, and to share the knowledge that that I always continuously learn. And so in my journey, so then moving along and going through law school and deciding to do my master's in law, and that's when I focused on our own laws, and our Haudenosaunee laws, and international law, and so basically talking about the great law of peace, and which is really only one of the sources of Haudenosaunee legal orders. So when I started that journey, I was starting to ask the questions of even of my father, who was a language speaker and was a teacher, and asking if there was actually a word for law, and finding that we didn't have a word very specifically about law, but we had to have a word about um, our way of being. So Agwenhuanya is the word for, our way of being or our way of life, and that our ways of being are the way that we think about who we are is a lot different than the non-Indigenous, I guess, colonial Eurocentric laws that I was learning in law school and then my master's, and made a very conscious decision to really focus on our own laws, and recognizing that our law is international law, that we have nations that came together um, in peace. We all of our nations as Haudenosaunee peoples and other nations all speak our own languages, and that when we come together as Indigenous nations, that was international law before the current colonial definition of international law, which didn't start until the 1950s, um, was defined, and that there is a whole different way of thinking about it, and our whole way of our relationships to the natural world is totally different. Um, so as I, in that journey for me and my education, um, it was really important for me to uh, to not only learn about our own ways, but also about healing and about understanding the impacts of colonization on our people, and especially on our women, because the women in our nations have taken the brunt of that. And so that's been a lot of my focus as well. So I made also then working on my PhD, I decided to focus on holistic health and the impacts of resource development on holistic health. And I focused in the Mohawk community of Akwesasne. And again, the question in the community was, and the Mohawk community being one of many of our Haudenosaunee communities, and asking the question, well, what makes us healthy? What makes us holistically healthy? And holistically meaning, all aspects of healthiness. So whether it's mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, as well as environmentally. So how are we healthy based on our environment around us, including the water and the land and all of creation. So that aspect of it was included as part of our healthiness, that it's not only our individual health that we need to take care of, but also the environment, everything around us as well, because it kept being very noticeable in the research and the conversations with the knowledge holders and people in the community, that our relationship to the land and the water and all of creation and everything that comes from our Thanksgiving address and our relationship to every living creature is also establishes our healthiness. And so I also asked the question, well, if we are healthy, what is it that makes us healthy? Um, and it was about the practice of our laws. And then said, okay, well, the practice of our laws. So then what are our laws? What makes us healthy? What's that connection that ensures our healthiness? And it's about the practice of our law. And so I also asked, okay, so what are our laws? And so going right back to the creation story. So that's this visual I have in front of you is a vision of creation from the Sky Woman in our creation story, and the vision of what it looked from her eyes. And this is my uncle Arnold Jacobs' art. Um, and he too is one of our traditional chiefs, traditional leadership. He holds that title. And so his knowledge is also incorporated into the art. And so I say also that that art is a source of our law, because our artists are also able to visualize our laws and create this visual for us to remember. And so when you think about that as one of the first sources of our law is the creation story, because everything that in the practice of our law, so in our ceremonies and when we're giving thanks, our ceremonies is also part of law. And it's traced directly to the creation story. So I don't have time to go through the details of the creation story, but I do know that, there's lots of resources, even online, that I've seen, and I teach this now. So, um, I've become the associate dean at the Faculty of Law. Um, well, mostly because my colleagues at the school felt that I was able to do the position, but I in my teaching, being able to now teach this in the law school to potential lawyers to understand our laws. So it's become a mandatory Indigenous legal orders course for all first year law students. So there's about 280 first year law students who are now learning about Indigenous legal orders and what they mean. And at Windsor, where we are, we have 3 Indigenous faculty who are teaching from our own laws, Anishinaabe, Cree, and myself being Haudenosaunee. And then we have guest instructors from the same 3 nations and teaching from our perspective. So it's very powerful, and we have elders in residence and elders who are able to support students in the law school. I never had that opportunity when I went, although I was close to home and being able to come home whenever I could to maintain my own sanity through this process of learning colonial law. But there was nothing like this in learning about our own laws in law school at that time. So this is where I wanted to start, was talking about, one of the sources of our laws was the creation story. So in moving forward, another source of our law that I like to talk about is our wampum belts. Our wampum belts have been used as a tool to remember our laws, to remember our history, a lot of detail. And a lot of people don't know what wampum is, but they were made from these shells. The quahog shell, they called, from the Atlantic. And so our people had traded, had gone to the East Coast to gather these shells in order to make the wampum belts. All along the eastern seaboard, the Mi'kmaq also used wampum, and the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, we all used wampum as part of our ceremonies. We used it in ceremony, but we also used it in remembering our laws and remembering our responsibilities. And so they were created to do that. And it was women's responsibilities who did weave those wampum belts. And I also call them art, pieces of art as well, because of the knowledge that went into them and the creativity and being able to remember and put those stories into the belts. And also what I like to acknowledge as well in that relationship that we have with all of creation is also about the water, because these shells come from the water. They were created in the water. And so there's that direct link that we have and the responsibility to the water, and also women's roles in creating the wampum belts and weaving them and thinking about our relationship to the water. So when we think about also the Peacemakers Journey during the Great Law of Peace and the Peacemakers Journey, one of the acknowledgements or one of the developments as well in the wampum use was actually handing a string of wampum to our leaders. So the women who became clan mothers, and I'll tell you a story about that as well, but also when the women chose the male leadership, they also used these strings of wampum to recognize their titles and their responsibilities to the people and to all of creation. And so these titles have been handed down. These wampum beads have been handed down from generation to generation, from the first relationship with the peacemaker and his journey through our territories. And so that's the power that we have and what we've used in using that as a tool to remember our laws. And it is wampum is one of the sources and what I call the sources of our laws. And so the Peacemaker's Journey, again, this is a powerful art piece actually by Oren Lyons, and his depiction of the Peacemaker's Journey. He was a spiritual man and a messenger of the Creator. And as part of his journey coming through our territories is traveling in a stone canoe, and so his creation of, and part of the understanding of his messages was having to prove himself, and one of them to have to prove to people that that he's a spiritual being is coming in our territories in a stone canoe. And so just acknowledging that that spiritual aspect of also of our laws, and the peacemaker's message, which were messages in what we call Creator's Law, and that his messages were delivered through him. And one of the teachings that we have about leadership actually is through also the Peacemaker's Journey. And one of the messages that he had from Creator was that he would journey to a woman first, and that the women had a huge responsibility in our leadership, and that the woman that he met, her name was Jigonsasa, and she lived in where present day Rochester, New York is. And when he met with her, it was part of the message from Creator to her, because where she lived, at that time our people were at war with each other. There was a lot of violence, a lot of unrest, and they say that it was very violent for everyone. It was not safe. It wasn't safe for women. It wasn't safe for children. And so the message of the Peacemaker and Creator's Law was about this messages of peace, the great law. And that in the language actually means, from what I understand, a literal translation is a great big love. And so if those messages of peace, of love are coming through, and the reason why he went to a woman first is because the Creator said that women have this instinct, that women have this unconditional love, this inherent peace, because not only because of the role that we have, and the Creator giving us the role to carry babies, to bring life, that we have that unconditional love for our babies and our families and our clans, and that that we would have this knowledge, to be able to share, um, with our children, and that responsibility that we have even as women amongst each other. So you can see there in this wampum belt is called the women's nomination belt. And the women's nomination belt was one of the first belts that was created to remember the role of the women in our nations. And that solid line that you can see that goes through the the images of beings. So those are the women standing, and our arms are linked together, and that's where the unity of women and the role that we have in our nations to be um, unified, and that we have that responsibility amongst each other to maintain that. And you can see the symbol in the center that is like the outline of our houses. So we lived in long houses, and that is where the acknowledgement of the leaders uh, of our longhouses were our women. So there were our clan mothers, and Jigonsasa became the first clan mother. And that's where her responsibility was to the women to share that knowledge and to share those responsibilities that we have as women. So she did travel, um, to share that knowledge with women who would become clan mothers and leaders in our territories. And you can see that in the center there's a square. There's many different interpretations about what that means. I've heard different aspects of it. One is a doorway. Um, One is the doorway to our longhouses, which means the leaders of our women are held at that doorway. But it's also, my understanding from another teaching is that it also represents Mother Earth, and that we're directly connected to Mother Earth because of her role, um, is the same as mothers' roles, as the same as women who are mothers or aunties. It doesn't mean that all women are have to be mothers. It means that we have that instinct, because not all women have babies, and it doesn't mean that that's what that responsibility is. But that is the responsibility that Creator gave to women to carry life, and that it's a huge responsibility, because when we carry our babies, we're also carrying our babies in that sacred water. And so in my, further research into the relationship that we have to water, is also when we carry our babies, because I learned from Gudgy Cook as well that, her, one of the things that she says is that women are the first environment. And so when we're carrying our babies, the baby's environment is in our womb and in the water. And that we all have a responsibility, including the fathers and the grandfathers and the men in our families, have that respect for our women, because they brought life and bringing life into this physical world. So there's that sacredness during that time of carrying birth and giving birth. So we have those ceremonies, birthing ceremonies and powerful naming ceremonies that the clan mothers are responsible also for naming our babies. And so, you know, there's ceremony, there's that spirituality that occurs in everything that we do. And so that's a huge responsibility. And generationally, when we become mothers and then grandmothers, and carrying those responsibilities and being decision makers on behalf of our clans, and choosing our male leadership, um, and the male leaders in our nations being the voice of the people, because that meant that our clans, you know, every individual person has a voice and carries it through their clan mothers, and the clan mothers then advise their male leadership about um, the voices of their clan. And then the male leadership sits in council and has the voices of their people and the voices of the women as they're making those decisions in council. So that's where the great law of peace and the whole what we call now a political process, and the leadership and the balance of leadership between male and female, and also the balance. It was always about balance. Everything that we did was about balance, and even acknowledging our relationship to all of creation. So moving forward, maybe 500 to 600 years is the estimate from the time that the Great Law of Peace was established, and when colonizers came to our shore. We already had relationships, like I said, with other nations um, in our community, and acknowledging our responsibilities to each other. There was already peace treaties being made even before the colonizers arrived on our shores. And so this wampum belt is called the Turo Guswenta. And so, like I said, there were already peace treaties being made with other nations before the colonizers ever showed. And so this Turo Wampum Guswenta established that relationship with the early colonizers. And I continue to recognize, you know, our wampum belts as being a very powerful tool to remember who we are, and to remember our relationship to each other as human beings, but also um, to the early colonizers, that it was part of the responsibilities under the Great Law that you know, the men would be responsible for external relationships with outside nations. And so when this belt was created, um, it was to acknowledge what was already known, that the relationships needed to be established to respect land and territory. So Guswenta actually literally translates into river of life. And so you can see the 3 rows of white, not only in the outside, but in the center, but also in between each one. And the 2 rows, the purple rows, but also there's 2 rows in between. So the one line, the 1 row represents Onguhowe, represents our canoe, Haudenosaunee laws, language, everything that makes us who we are. And like I said in the beginning about Ogwenhwenhya, which means our ways of being, is held in our canoe. And on the other side was their ship, which held their laws, their culture, their tradition, their belief system. And as I have been working on understanding what that means, and talking about Haudenosaunee laws specifically, and hearing even other nations that their laws too as well, talk about our responsibilities. It's more of our responsibilities to each other as human beings, our responsibilities to all of creation. It's a word that has been translated well from our language. So that's what's held in our canoe. And then on the other side, once we start talking about colonial law, then all of a sudden we start talking about rights and talking about individual rights. We never had individual, well, we do. We have our responsibilities as individuals, but it didn't become about rights. It didn't become about rights until colonial legal systems started talking about human rights and liberal, small l, liberal human rights, which means very individual. And so there's a whole different world view between our laws, ours talking about our responsibilities, and that if we're to work together. And so that was the intention also of my PhD, is that looking at the framework of Gus Wenta, there was a healthy relationship, or there was supposed to be a healthy relationship based on 3 basic principles of peace, respect, and friendship. So that's what those 3 white rows represented. And when we talk about white, just the whole concept of white was about sacredness, and the sacredness of this relationship that our people have never forgotten about. And actually, every time, we try to have negotiations with Canada, and the reason why we think that they need to take responsibility is because this relationship was made with the British Crown. It was made before the British Crown, the French, and with the Dutch, and then also with the United States. So when we established this relationship, it was understood that this relationship would continue on this river of life forever. And so for some reason, with the colonial laws that have been enforced in this place called Canada now, we've been forced into their colonial system on many different levels, whether it's education, law, health, social system, right? Everything that's been established has been under their colonial legal system. And so now, with people understanding that violent relationship and understanding what happens in a violent relationship when people reclaim their voice, this is what's happening today. So a lot of our people reclaiming voice, reclaiming our relationship to our land and responsibilities to our lands and our waters and all of creation, in order to think about our responsibilities today to those future generations. So, so some people take that literally, that we have that responsibility. I'm going to stand on the land today and I'm going to protect our lands and our waters. And they have that responsibility according to our laws. And so that's what's happening here at Six Nations with 1492 Land Back Lane, that our young people have decided it's my responsibility, and I'm going to take that responsibility to look after not only my children, but everyone's children for the future. So I just wanted to share that this whole, Gus Wenta and the theories of Gus Wenta continue on to today. And if we want to talk about reconciliation, this is what reconciliation is, about having a healthy relationship. Because when I talk about having those healthy relationships, it's also, when having peace with another party. I like using this as a tool, even talking about gender violence and gender relationships, that when we do have a relationship with someone, we have to have peace with ourselves. That we have to trust ourselves, and we have to be a friend. We have to be friends of ourselves before we can be friends with anyone else, or to trust anyone else, or to respect anyone else. So that's the basis of this relationship, and to return to that relationship and respecting each other's ways of being, and why I've also taken on this responsibility to share this knowledge, and also to also um, practice my law, practice Haudenosaunee law. So practicing actually means an action that I'm, um, you know, um, attending to ceremonies, getting to ceremonies when I can, um, understanding the recitals of the great law, all of the things that help me to understand our relationship, and the responsibility to our laws, and also sharing them. This is this is uh, something that my partner is an artist, and so when I was creating my dissertation, I had asked him to put this together, because this is the findings from my research about our women and being the center, the femininity of Haudenosaunee laws, and the strength of the women in our nations, and being the leaders, but also recognizing the strength and the balance of our men, and that's what the wampum belt, the wampum circle of 50 titles, of 50, they call it sachems, um, but it's the language for our male leadership, and so this represents the cycle even of our ceremonies, and the star representing the spirituality of who we are as a people. And you can see the 4 directions as well, because everything's a cycle in those four areas, however you want to think about them. And also the ripples of the water in the center, and our relationship to the water, and that the ripple effect, is also recognition of our relationship to all of creation. And so that has become part of the work of my PhD. And one of the other parts that I understood, that this continues, that our knowledge and our laws continue with our young people, and how it's becoming revitalized, and our young people going through a ceremony called Ohalogo. And it was, in Akwesasne, where I did my study, and, this photo was shared with me, and I used what's called photo voice to recognize the visuals of our nations. But this is also the recognition of not only of that ceremony, but also of our young people, and the strength that they have today to remember who we are, and to continue on with our laws, and sharing our laws, and the respect of who we are as a people, and the relationship of our young women to our grandmas, and our aunties, and our mothers, is so important. And that's what this ceremony also acknowledges, a relationship to the whole community, and that we're just one. We are one person, one individual within a whole collective of our clans and our nations. So I'm close to being finished, but I also wanted to. This was also a couple of photos from the photo voice in my dissertation. But it's also to recognize again our relationship to the water, and that was a lot of that acknowledgement, especially in Akwesasne, because they're right in the midst of the St. Lawrence, which is our traditional territory of the Mohawk Nation, Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening to me. Again, I also leave this with an understanding that all of us as human beings are responsible, whether it's our law, whether it's our relationship to our environment, that everyone has that responsibility, and even thinking at least 7 generations ahead in every decision that's being made, because everything that I do today, I think very consciously about how that has an impact 7 generations from now, and knowing that my grandchildren, my children in the future are going to see that that we did everything that we could in order to protect our lands and territories for them. So Nyawa, and thank you for, again, the opportunity to share this knowledge with you.
That was terrific.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Before I get started, I want to give people a chance to maybe think about some questions. And before we do that, I'm wondering if you mentioned some of the artists in your presentation. I'm wondering if you could share the names of the artists throughout your presentation for the pieces.
Sure. Let me just get back there. So this is Pat Sandy. So that's my partner in crime. He's an artist. He's a retired iron worker. But yeah, he helped me to bring my dissertation together. This is Raymond Sky did this piece of art, and Oren Lyons and Arnold Jacobs.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, no, wonderful presentation. Blown away always by just the wealth of knowledge and being so generous with the knowledge as well. I think that I have some big questions. I guess I'll ask a couple of questions while we wait. Anybody who's with us, any of the attendees are welcome to type out a question, and I'll be sure to ask. So my question is, I think it's sort of like there's the piece of the responsibility, and coming from an Anishinaabe-centric sort of like thinking, you know, like we have a certain responsibility in ourselves to like gain knowledge, but also before we go to pass that knowledge along. And I think that's sort of how our sort of journey kind of works. And I'm wondering about, in terms of your context. So what is the role of the learner, or the youth or the children? You spoke about it a little bit, and I was just wondering if you could share that a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think, with the part of the difficulty actually in doing this online with the webinar is actually not being able to see anybody. That's one of my difficulties with this, doing it this way, because what I like usually is to be able to see the audience and to know whether, is everybody picking this up? Is everybody, understanding what I'm saying, because I usually have a real connection to people who are listening. And so that's where I see that happening is especially with Indigenous peoples, and learning is very visual. So that's where I see this as well, with you using visuals rather than words, is showing that. And even with the Wampum Belts and the teachings that they have is also very visual. And that our laws were actually never really written, I guess, in in what we call the letters, but they were written in art. They were written in our wampum belts in a totally different way than how colonial understanding about the written documentation in whether the colonial language, whether it's French or English or any other language like that. So for me, I learned it more that way than ever than learning it from the books. Learning, our way of learning is practicing, is putting ourselves in those spaces, in those places, and not having to to read the books, like the colonial education has forced things to happen that way.
Absolutely.
I
Thank
hope
you.
I answered your question.
No, that's absolutely. And I mean, again, in person, it's also, there's a tactile element. And then just like the beadwork kind of being like a library in a sense as well. I wanted to just go through a couple of notes. Just people saying thank you, saying it was terrific. And a question from Alan. Thank you, Bev, for sharing this history and these ideas so clearly. It was a fascinating talk. I have a question about your discussion of responsibilities to community. Sorry, it's flipped up on me. And each other earth versus colonial rights, which are so often phrased as negative, freedom from. Indigenous people have effectively used the human rights framework in recent years, for example, with UNDRIP, but clearly the overall impact of liberal rights ideology has been destructive to Indigenous society in many places. What, in your view, is the place of human liberal rights in the recovery and reestablishment of Indigenous legal forms in the future, if there is any role at all?
Yeah, I totally understand the question. I think the biggest struggle, especially with the United Nations and the human rights framework, is, again, we've been sort of forced into that paradigm, into that framework of thinking of individual rights or human rights. But I also see it as a tool of bringing attention of our responsibilities in that kind of framework. That's the only thing that I could see happening within the United Nations is bringing attention to it in the global spaces. And actually where Indigenous peoples are able to come together to share common understanding. And that's why I see with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was like a minimum understanding, a minimum standard, because there were a lot of things. I was part of the negotiations when that declaration was being not only drafted, but at the time it was implemented at the UN, that there was still a lot of disagreement about what was actually put into that declaration, because there's still some language that some Indigenous peoples didn't agree with, but it was a collective agreement that it would be at a minimum framework, but that we need to ensure that it's incorporated into the territories where we're from, and those minimal standards by Canadian and colonial governments to recognize those rights and responsibilities of our peoples and our territories. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that. Leona writes, Beverley, thank you so much for your generosity of sharing your knowledge. I have struggled with the ability to articulate how sustainability is so much more important for a woman, a life giver. Articulating it as being the first environment resonated with me. As a grandmother, I have always felt that work in leadership has become much more meaningful for me as we seek to decolonize, reorganize, and reposition ourselves for continued work towards sustainability. Through a climate lens, resource lens, and relationship lens, you have magnified the highly embedded importance of women in leadership. Heart emoji, and I can't pronounce that. I'm so sorry. I believe it says thank you. Lorianne writes, can you ask Beverley to speak about the laws through Haudenosaunee work people may usually consider decorative, like beadwork on clothing? Are there laws to be seen in all Haudenosaunee art, a form of Indigenous knowledge, perhaps?
Yeah, I would say that it's knowledge. It's knowledge that's being visualized for us. I don't know. Art can be in many different forms. So, if we're talking about understanding, um, understanding that knowledge is important, and I think that's where um, also understanding, even when you're bringing in different forms of art um, as a source of law, it's more about how it's been used so that we remember, and that it's not imposed on one person, which is also what's in our ways of being, that it isn't just one person that has knowledge, that when you bring all of the artists together, when you bring all the knowledge holders together, you can piece together similarities but also differences, and everybody recognizes that and respects that. And so I think that's a huge part of um, acknowledging that.
Brilliant. Rick writes, Oren Lyons speaks of natural law, the law of the earth and weather, and often paints it as merciless and unforgiving. Do you believe that earth law is the first law and that we have gone way too far from those teachings to survive?
Yeah, it's definitely he's one of my teachers, so he has a huge impact on a lot of people, on everybody who's he's there. He already knows. He's been there for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Emma writes, Nyawen Beverley, thank you for this very enlightening presentation. To answer your question, even though you can't see me, I have been connecting with what you have shared, so thank you. My question is this. You mentioned at the beginning that when you began learning more about Haudenosaunee law in your adult life, you started to realize how much you were taught growing up. What has it been like for you personally, reconnecting and remembering these laws and ways of life? And then how have they impacted you in your day-to-day life?
Well, it's funny. That's a really good question, and it connects to Rick's comment as well, in our relationship to my relationship. And growing up and I feel like being embedded in it. So growing up in it and the connections to to the ceremonies, and not realizing that how much, like when I said how much I was taught, because it was always around me, whether it was with, my grandparents who were both, one being a faith keeper, one was a clan mother. My uncle was one of the chiefs, and just, I grew up with that. And so it was like, I thought everybody grew up like that until I went to school and realized, no, not everybody had that kind of knowledge. Um, and um, and I remember my uncle when I was in law school and I was ready to quit. Um, but I would always come home for ceremony, and I was telling him, and he said, well, that there isn't a lot of people that are able to learn about another people's laws, that you should actually consider that a gift. And I was like, I don't know about that. But anyway, it was just remembering his support. And then when I finished my master's in law, and I was, again, back to ceremony at home, and he was saying, well, now it's time to learn your own laws. Now it's time to reconnect. And sure enough, every time I felt that disconnect, whenever I was away somewhere, I travel a lot, and it was when I was back in ceremony when I felt that reconnection. So even though I may have gone away and I come back, and it's like this cycle, everything comes back full circle. And even when I started, this whole journey that I was on, from the time from leaving home to go to law school, to now coming back home again, and now back home again, is actually the same thing that my uncle had said, is returning back to the same, and returning back to the understanding of our responsibilities that we have, and that we have those responsibilities. And also what's reconnected me is about the responsibilities of women, and what my responsibility. So I meant to say that with Rick, is that when we start talking about earth law, it's about Mother Earth law. It's about mother law, that we also have that responsibility. And that is our first law, is mother law, in our relationship to our mother. And that is our first law. It's that same connection of women being the first environment, that our earthly responsibilities that we have as human beings is directly connected. So that's what's always brought me back to my responsibilities, to give thanks to that every time in ceremony.
Excellent. So I want to keep rolling. I know the time is 3:00, and anybody who has to go, I just wanted to let you know that we're going to keep going a little bit here, as long as people have questions. Thank you for your answer and the great questions. But I just wanted to, for anybody who has to leave, just wanted to let you know we have another presentation coming up next month, and that's with Dr. Gregory Cagete, who's a Native American educator whose work is dedicated to honoring the foundations of Indigenous knowledge and education. Dr. Cagete is a scholar of herbalism, holistic health, also designs culturally responsive curriculum geared to the special needs and learning styles of Native American students. As well, this session will be online on the ONLC website, and you can check back in a couple of days and the audio recording will be there. And I think everybody has a link to a survey. If you could fill that out, that'd be really great. You get some of your feedback, and hopefully we can make these sessions a little better. But yeah, so but again, yeah, I'm going to keep going as long as people have questions, and I think I'm going to ask a couple of my own as well. So Edith writes, my recommendation for all PhD scholars would be to have traditional laws and the PhD candidates requiring to have ceremonial backgrounds according to what the clan or nation views as ceremony, specifically for the clan or geographic location. It is PhD scholars who can create the framework for the future generation. Just a thought. Thank you again for your wisdom. That comes from Edith, Swampy Cree instructor for Northern Saskatchewan Indigenous Teacher Education Program. So I guess what's your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts on having sort of like the ceremonial aspect alongside of, I guess, like the Western?
Yeah, I think that would be really powerful because that connects. I think the ceremonial aspects and the giving thanks aspects of it would, I think, that reconnection is what's important, and healing. And I think that's where a lot of, for me, as going through, I use my education as part of my healing as well. So understanding the violence that not only has occurred to me, but the violence even against our people. And when it feels like when we reconnect to our ceremonies, to giving thanks, to our responsibilities, to all of creation, it takes a whole different perspective when it comes to all the crazy politics that occurs. It's grounding. And I think that's what's important, to stay grounded.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And I wanted to circle back to something mentioned before. And it's around the piece around natural law. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on are, can that exist under a colonial system? Under a capitalist system?
Well, the capitalist system needs to learn natural law, because if the capitalist system understood what natural law means, then they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
Absolutely.
It's pretty simple, but
it seems simple. It seems really, really simple, right?
it is. Well, if you think about what's more powerful, like what has power, what has more power, if you want to talk about power, because capitalist is about power, money power. Right? If you think about natural law and the power of natural law, what's going to survive?
Mm-hmm.
Because natural law came before we did as human beings. We have to rely on natural law, on natural earth law, mother law, in order to survive. Right? There's been enough teachings, enough metaphors, I guess, right, that you can't eat money. So I think we really need to rethink our relationship to that. It helps us to survive today, but it's like you have to really think, and that also comes to our teachings about our relationship to the natural world and our prophecies. And our prophecies are telling us what's going to happen. And we're right in the midst of a prophecy, and we have to make a choice of the future. And there's lots of things that we need to do as human beings to reconnect to the natural world, because natural world is going to survive a long time before we do as human beings.
Absolutely. I mean, it's evident in how quickly, when we paused for a couple of months, just how clean the air became, how the vegetation came back, how the animals started coming out again. even just after a very, very short pause, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I wanted to give you the opportunity to just give any last words, any for the attendees. Nope. Okay. All right, so huge thanks again. Thank you very much for your time imparting knowledge. And thank you very much to Karen as well for facilitating, and all of our attendees and panelists. Be sure to register and sign up for the next webinar next month. Thank you so much again, and I'll hand it over to Karen.